Welcome in, everyone. I've got another special guest with me today who actually happens to be en route on his way to cover the Bulls at the season opener in Detroit. He's been kind enough to meet with us despite his busy schedule, our very own Bulls beat writer and Casey Johnson of NBC Sports Chicago, who joins us over the phone. Casey, it's good to have you back on the show, and appreciate you making the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Sure. So, Casey, the last time I had you on, it was around July timeframe, I believe. And since then, a lot has happened with this Bulls roster. And although, I do want to talk about the offseason, the Bulls free agency moves, training camp, touch a bit on the preseason, I did want to start actually with talking about this upcoming season and expectations, for this new Bulls team, since we're now less than 24 hours away from tipping off the season for the Bulls. And I had Rob on a few days ago, and I'm going to try to make sure my questions are varied here. But one thing I did ask him that I'm curious about to hear from you as well are your expectations for this upcoming season. Obviously, a lot of polarizing views on, how this Bulls team will perform, from some people saying that they're barely going to make the playoffs to some saying that they're going to be title contenders. I know you recently came out with your article on your Bulls bold predictions, and one of them was the Bulls being a top 6 seed. So what are your expectations of the Bulls this season, and where do you think that they'll ultimately finish if it is in fact in the top 6?
Yeah, so I should preface that by saying I'm really bad at sports predictions. I just feel like I'm getting that question a lot. Where are the Bulls going to finish? How are they going to be? And I guess I would start more generally and then get more specific. And generally speaking, I don't think any of us know, obviously, but what I think everyone would agree with is they've undeniably significantly upgraded their talent. And that to me is just going to be the enjoyable and entertaining aspect to this season, in the sense that, you're just going to see better basketball and more entertaining basketball product on the floor on a nightly basis. And that's, I think, encouraging for any Bulls fan. I got a little tweaked for saying that's not a bold prediction, top 6. I kind of think it is. I mean, because you nailed it. I mean, the range and the predictions have been all over the map in terms of where this team's going to finish. And, Vegas obviously is pretty well documented. I'm not a gambler, but, the odds makers have this team not finishing very highly. So I think top 6 and taking the play-in tournament out of the question is kind of a bold prediction, because I think a lot of people aren't convinced that this mix of talent is going to produce a good record. I personally think they're going to win in that 44, 45, I guess high end might be 46 win range, and where that falls in the conference you can't say, but I do think that this team has a chance to take that play-in out of the equation and finish in the top 6.
Well, let me ask you this: what would be sort of like a bare minimum, or I guess not bare minimum? What would be, the least you would see them be able to actually fall into? I think last time we talked, and you're saying that anything less than a 6 seed would be a disappointment. Would you still consider that to be the case? It's probably even more so now that they've added a lot of talent since we've last spoken. What would you say is sort of like, if it's anything below this, that's a disappointing season for the Bulls?
Yeah, I'm still going top 6. I mean, I said that, like you said, before they added all the moves they add in the offseason, and I based that on what they did at the trade deadline. Now I did feel like Tice was probably on his way out of town. But when you make a trade like you did for Vucevic, and we can kind of get into the DeMar DeRozan talk and how some people thought that was an overpay, I would always argue that the Vucevic trade in some ways was even bolder than the DeMar DeRozan trade, because of all the draft capital you sacrificed. I know you sacrificed some in both, but I don't know. Vucevic to me was a significant win now move, and they've obviously just continued down that path. So to me, it's top 6 or bust. And I think if everything breaks right, if obviously if they're playing out of their mind and they stay injury free, I think, top 4 would probably be high end. But I think anything below top 6, then you've really kind of, put yourself in a difficult situation, because you have burned as much draft capital as you've burned.
Yeah. Now, I actually want to go back to your bold predictions that you came out with a couple days ago, which, by the way, for those listening in, I'll leave a link to Casey's article on that in the description. Be sure to check it out. But one of your bold predictions, Casey, which I actually like the most, was that the Bulls will finish top 3 in deflections this season. Now, like you know, I also do an annual bold predictions video for the Bulls, and one of my bold predictions was that the Bulls will actually finish top 10 in defense this season. Yours is slightly, you know, a little bit different in that it's more specific, but still related. I'm curious to know, what's your view on the Bulls defense this season as a whole? Because that's sort of been the biggest gripe with the national media on why they think this team won't be that great, is because their defense is going to be terrible. And it bothers me when I hear that, because if you look at this team from top to bottom, on paper, they're actually not bad defensively. You have Lonzo and Patrick in the starting lineup who are solid defenders. You know, Lonzo actually gives you the most perimeter defense, which they didn't have at all last season, and still managed to finish 12th in the league in defensive rating. You have Alex Caruso, a very underrated defender, another perimeter defender, and then of course, you know, you got Tony Bradley, Derek Jones Jr., Troy Brown Jr. I mean, the list goes on. I'm not saying this is going to be an elite defensive team. You know, they're going to have their challenges on that end of the floor, especially in the starting lineup. I get that they lost Thaddeus and Tice, but I struggle to see how people think that this is going to be a lousy defensive team. What's sort of your perspective on this?
Well, my perspective starts with Billy Donovan, and if you just obviously look at his track record, he gets teams to guard, and this goes back obviously to his college days. I mean, he always had, you know, some of the top defenses in the country, you know, when in that dynasty he built in Florida. So let's start there. I mean, if you just look at the different personnel he had in his time in Oklahoma City, he always got those teams to guard. I believe he had 4 top 10 defenses in his 5 seasons in Oklahoma City, and that personnel changed. So let's start there. I mean, he gets teams to guard. You mentioned last season finishing 12th defensive rating. You know, that was a very disjointed season with significant roster overhaul, and they come out of it with a you know, just outside the top 10 defensive team. So let's start there. I probably am drinking a little bit of the preseason Kool-Aid, because they did not face, you know, obviously elite competition until you got to Memphis. But I thought actually the Memphis game was pretty telling. It's one game, I know, and it's preseason, I know, but that's a significant challenge for what you can point to as the biggest weakness, and that's size. I mean, they're going to be battling size issues all season. Billy has owned that. He's been transparent about that. So I thought they held their own against a very physical and big Memphis team. Their rebounding was good that game. You know, I think you mentioned the starting lineup. I think the narrative on Vucevic as a poor defender has gone so over the top that it needs to kind of come back the other direction a little bit. He's not a bad team defender. He's not good in space, you know, one-on-one switched on to smaller players, obviously. But, you know, in a team defensive scheme where he's kind of in a soft drop mode or kind of protecting the paint, he's fine. And he's a decent rim protector and a good defensive rebounder. So, you know, it's clear they're going to be trying to play a very switching style with, you know, moving parts, guys guarding multiple positions, a lot of wings, you know, deflections, getting the passing lanes. And you nailed it. Lonzo is kind of the head of the snake there. And I got to say, man, Lonzo, when you watch him now, it's been 4 games up close and personal. He is really, really good defensively, man. He is just he's long, he's smart, he anticipates actions very well. He gets over screens. He's kind of unfazed by what happens. He just kind of keeps coming at you. So, and then there's Caruso, who obviously addresses a huge issue they had last season. That was point of attack. I mean, he's very good at blowing up pick and roll and kind of being an annoying disruptor in that action. So, you know, we'll see. I mean, that's why they play the games, but I'm kind of buying Bulls defensive stock right now. I've been intrigued by what I've seen during the preseason.
Yeah. Well, you talked about, you know, Vucevic and, you know, being a better defender than people are probably giving him credit for. I would say the same probably goes for Lavine. I mean, we saw him in the Olympics. He was a decent defender. I mean, not even, you know, people always talk about how he's a good on the ball defender, but off the ball, he's not as great. He was a good off ball defender in the Olympics. And so I think if you add that also on top of what they have in Lonzo and Patrick, and again, Vucevic, they're not going to be that bad defensively. And I think that's sort of my biggest issue with the way that the national media is portraying this Bulls team is, yeah, they're going to be great on offense, but terrible on defense. And I just, can't for the life of me quite figure it out. So let's talk about free agency for a bit. Like I said, I talked to Rob about free agency as well. But what I wanted to ask you, actually, because you have a longer history covering the team, do you think that this offseason represented a shift in how players around the league sort of view the Chicago Bulls as a franchise? And what I mean by that is, really over the course of the last 2 decades, and even more than that, you can include the dynasty years in that, there's always been sort of this perception that Chicago is not the place that you want to be as a player. That's not an attractive destination, despite it being in a big market, despite it being a historic franchise. There was always this sentiment that the culture in Chicago is toxic starting from the top. And with this new front office and what they've been able to do in just, one off season, it seems like that, negative sentiment is no longer there. And that's sort of paving the pathway forward and players being excited to be in Chicago. You being in the media, working for the team, or, covering the team for a long time, do you get that sense as well, or do you think it's maybe not quite there yet?
Well, I would answer that on multiple levels because you're right. I have covered the team longer than Rob. So first of all, while I think there is some merit at times to that notion, I think it's also a little misplaced. And here's why I would say that. I was covering the team when the Bulls acquired Ben Wallace, and you can say that didn't work out or what have you. At the time, that was a seismic move. Not only did you get multiple Defensive Player of the Year winner, you stole him from a division rival. That kind of stuff just didn't happen at that time. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you can say what you want about them striking out on the big three and not getting those guys, obviously, and Carlos Boozer became a polarizing figure for a lot of Bulls fans, but he was a good signing and was important to that was important to what the Bulls were trying to do at the time, and obviously helped kind of build that conference champion. I mean, it wasn't just Carlos, but it was all that depth that they signed in that summer. So that was number two. Then again, didn't take him to the promised land, but Pau Gasol turned down more money from premier franchises in like the Spurs and the Thunder to sign with the Bulls. I mean, he wanted to come play for the Bulls. And then there's the runner-up status of being in the mix for Carmelo, et cetera. So I probably am a little bit in the minority thinking that the Bulls have been so bad in free agency. It's just because they didn't get the big guys. They didn't, but they were in the mix for them. So that's that. Sure. And then to your point as to what they happened this summer, it's always circumstance. I mean, because here's the thing. Yes, they got their big targets, and yes, there is definitely some momentum around the Bulls right now. They're a buzz team right now. There's some intrigue around them. And there does seem to have a different vibe, with management and this coaching staff, et cetera. There's like a new direction in this franchise. But, they also drew some fire for overpaying DeMar DeRozan. So sure. It's all nuance is what I'm trying to say. It's like, on the one hand, yes, this was a great offseason in the sense they got their targets. But, time will tell if the DeRozan thing was an overpay. The ball contract's fine, and that is a big move because, they went out and got their number one target, and they did it, after obviously expressing interest in the March trade deadline. So it was definitely a fascinating summer. I think the biggest aspect to it is just how they did it all without cap space and, engineering all the sign-in trades. So it's going to be really fun to see how it all plays out. But yes, to your question, there does seem to be a different energy and vibe league-wide about this franchise right now.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of it just has to do with the fact that as Bulls fans over the last couple of years, there's just been so much, not issues, if you will, but there's always just sort of been a disconnect, it seems, between the players and the front office. And you just get the sense that with this new front office that they really value and trust them as a front office, and vice versa, right? The front office has a great deal of respect for the players that they have. And so I just think that, as fans, that's comforting because that should things potentially not really work out as planned for this season, that going forward, that this team is going to be trying to at least build to contend in the future. That's one thing that I appreciate.
Yeah, no,
Now,
I agree with that. I want to say one more point about that because I
sure,
agree with that. I want to agree with I agree with that, but I would also say this is like I think more specifically, it's like it's a heck of a lot easier to get excited about a player who has a track record like DeMar DeRozan or a young talent on the ascent who's going into his fifth year in Lonzo Ball, or a crowd favorite who has a championship ring and is endorsed by LeBron James and Alex Caruso. then okay, here's the 7th overall pick. Trust us. It's Wendell Carter Jr. Boom. It's Coby White. Boom. It's Lauri Markkanen. Boom. And that's not to knock John and Gar because, they built around the draft very well for a long time. It's just this last run of 7 picks have been kind of underwhelming. And, they'll be the first to admit that. So it's more specifically that is that, you don't need to like work yourself up into this false hope over like this 7th pick that may or may not pan out. It's like DeMar DeRozan's, he's a badass. I mean, that's just there's no getting around it. So that's kind of where I see how the difference is.
For sure. Now, you recently met with Nikola Vucevic on the Bulls Talk podcast, which was a great session, by the way. For those that missed it, be sure to check it out. I always like it when you guys do these one-on-one interviews with players that give us fans a chance to kind of know them a little bit more on a personal level. And, you had actually talked about one of the things with Vucevic was him growing up as a Bulls fan, living overseas, which I think a lot of kids we're big Bulls fans. If you grew up in the 90s, I'm around the same age as Vucevic, and that dynasty is really what made me a fan of the game of basketball, to begin with. I've always wondered, is there something to be said about a player playing for a team that they were a fan of growing up? The last time we met, we had talked about our basketball playing days, which you made it a lot further than I did, making it to Division III ball in college. But as a young kid, my dream was to make it to the NBA. And I wanted to play for the Bulls, and I only wanted to play for the Bulls. Do you think it's different, for players to be playing for a team they grew up being a fan of, and maybe that motivating them when they put on that Bulls jersey? And I know Derrick Jones Jr. also said the same thing. He grew up watching Derrick Rose and became a fan of the Bulls because of Rose, which made me feel old, by the way. But do you think that has any kind of impact on them as a player?
I think not really on the court and on a game-to-game basis because, look, this is their job. So they're professionals, and whichever franchise they're playing for, they're going to commit to that and be professional, and, it's their livelihood. So there's that. But what I would say is, and you could hear it in the conversation I had with Vooch, is there's definitely an appreciation. And look, I mean, even if as a visiting player, there's an appreciation for that dynasty because of the history and where it sits in the spectrum of the game and the history of the NBA, number one, and also Chicago's a world-class city and there's an appeal to it, and the fan base. I mean, for so many years it's sold out, and the United Center's one of the better arenas in the league. So there's just so many aspects to Chicago's place in the NBA that players have that appreciation for it. And then you get a guy like Vooch, who obviously has that kind of foreign perspective to it. I think it just kind of heightens it a little bit. But, once the game starts, he's obviously, and all players are obviously going to be playing as hard as they can and working as hard as they can for whatever franchise they represent because it's their job.
Sure. I think the other thing that I caught from that podcast that I believe he said was that, or maybe it was you that said it, that his dad actually played until he was 44. Is that correct?
Yeah, he said it. I didn't say it. He said it.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you already knew it, you'd asked him and he confirmed it. But yeah, I mean, initially my thought was, well, that's good to know in terms of Vucevic's longevity, because I think that's one of the things that people were griping about this trade was, well, he's already 30 years old, now he's 31, and it's like, how much longer is he going to have? It's like, well, if his dad played until he's 44, probably should be good. But anyway, separate topic. One of the things we talked about last time was how impactful some of these smaller things, if you will, matter. Like Patrick Williams getting some run in the summer league and also getting selected to Team USA, the select team, and Zach Lavine getting selected to the Olympics. You mentioned even the Suns having that incredible run in the bubble despite falling short of making it to the postseason. How these things are actually important to a team. I wanted to get your take on the Bulls preseason and the incredible run that they had in just those 4 games. That even though it is preseason, we always have to add that preseason qualifier and how we're discussing the team's overall performance with that. But how meaningful do you think it was to see the Bulls play as well as they did in the preseason, even though it wasn't against the best competition, and even though it doesn't count towards anything record-wise?
I think it was important in the sense that Billy clearly approached the preseason as important, and the players, I should say. But, he played those starters like decent minutes from game 1 on. And then by, game 3, he was playing them basically regular starters minutes. So that's another way to keep it in perspective, because obviously they weren't playing the greatest competition.
Right.
And the Bulls were treating it very seriously. But here's why, regardless of the final scores, it was important, because this is a lot of new parts, and it does take playing together to develop chemistry, number one. And also, to me, it established a style of play. And so for someone like myself, and this hopefully doesn't sound conceited, but, I've watched, thousands of NBA games.
Of course, yeah.
It's like I can see that this style of play is going to translate. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to beat, the Bucks or the Nets on a consistent basis or what have you, but you can see a style of play starting to form. They're going to try to wreak havoc defensively with deflections and steals and getting to passing lanes and switching, and they're going to hope that leads to transition opportunities. Offensively, if they don't get something in transition, they're going to obviously had a lot of read and react and high basketball IQ players reading and reacting off each other with an unselfish mindset. I mean, I saw a ton of unselfishness in this preseason. Right. And that to me is like, that's going to stick. I mean, so regardless of if they went 4-0 or not, or regardless of if they, blew out teams or what have you, it's like they started to form an identity. And that's what jumped out to me, is that they, with a bunch of new parts and a bunch of new shiny toys, they started to build an identity. And obviously they've got to continue that during the regular season. But that's why, as an observer, I was probably encouraged from what I saw for Bulls fans.
Well, and that's what's so key, right? Is building that identity, and the fact they did it so quickly. That's what really stood out to me in the preseason, was the fact that they just right off the bat looked like they were clicking, and they were firing on all cylinders, and it was like they had been doing this for a really long time.
That's right.
And that's what was really encouraging for me as a fan. The other thing I noticed was that how electric and energized the United Center was, the fans in general. I'm sure, now that you guys are back at the games, what was it like being at the United Center, and even in a preseason environment, having it feel almost like a postseason environment? That's kind of what it felt like to me, at least, watching it on TV, especially in that last game against the Grizzlies.
Yeah, and I think that would actually be another reason to kind of place this in the perspective of how it is important, because to me it just kind of kept the momentum going of this offseason. I mean, there is a lot of intrigue and excitement about all these offseason moves, and then boom, here's a 4-0 preseason. So, and you're right, 3 of those games were at home. So, it just, to me, it just kind of kept the buzz and the intrigue and excitement going in a positive direction. I mean, if you make all those moves and then you come out and you look flat, or you go 0-4, then you're like, okay, is this going to work? I mean,
right.
And it still may not work, but, it just seems like it's trending the right direction. So in that sense, I thought it was important. Yeah, and it's nice. I think even the players talked about just how it's nice to kind of have that atmosphere back and that excitement back. So it's on them. It's on them to keep that going here in Chicago.
Yeah. So final question, Casey, because I know you have a busy night and day ahead of you tomorrow, and it's probably an easy one for you, but I have to ask it. Who do you have in tomorrow's opener? Is there anything that we should be looking out for in this game? Obviously, I know, it was recently announced that Cade Cunningham isn't going to be available for the Pistons. So who do you have?
Well, I think the Bulls are going to win. I actually think they're going to win pretty handily.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing I asked Billy Donovan after practice today. We're taping this on Tuesday. What kind of advantage is there in facing the same opponent twice in the first 4 games, or is there an advantage? And he brought up a good point, is that they're facing Detroit on Saturday after the home opener Friday against New Orleans. So it's the second of a back-to-back. And so when you have a quick turnaround like that, that is beneficial because you have some familiarity with the opponent. You know, it's not a totally fresh scout. It's not a totally fresh game prep. You've got something, you know, you can build off of from the first game. So, and that leads into my larger point. I mean, if you look at those first 4 games, and I know the cliche is one game at a time, whatever, but, you know, I don't have to subscribe to that cliche because I'm a sports writer. So it's like, I mean, they should go 4-0. I mean,
they should,
you know, yeah,
potentially even 5-0.
Yeah, well, I just looked at those first 4, but I mean, you know, New Orleans is obviously banged up. Siakam's out for Toronto, and Detroit's not good, and has, you know, the number 1 overall pick out for sure one game, most likely both games. So, and look, if this team starts 4-0 after a 4-0 preseason, I mean, there you go. That just kind of continues to build the momentum. So, and that would just be exactly what Bulls fans need, because that would kind of get everybody excited about this team.
Yeah, and I think it's the last time the Bulls were above 500 at any point was 2017 when they still had Jimmy Butler. Is that right?
I blocked it out, but that sounds right.
It sounds about right. Yeah, it's been a while. Either way, it's been a while. So yeah, the fact if the Bulls can pull out a win tomorrow, that would mean they're above 500 for the first time in a long time. And agreed. I absolutely think they should go 4-0 given the circumstances. Although the schedule in November is going to be hard. I think that's going to be their true test, if you will. Once we
all the more reason they need to start fast.
Exactly. All the more get those easy wins out of the way, right? Let's not play down to our competition like we're used to seeing from the Bulls. But anyway, KC, as always, really, really appreciate the time. I said the same thing to Rob, but we really do appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to meet with us Bulls fans. I know it's obviously a very busy time of year for you guys in the media, so I really do mean that, and appreciate all the work that you guys do in covering the team. And hopefully safe journey to Detroit, and hopefully it'll be a good game tomorrow for you guys.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. We can do it again during the season, so appreciate it, man.